what causes climate change, we understand its impact, and we know how to mitigate it. The forces that are slowing the transition to renewable energy are economic, technological, political, and cultural. Transforming our economy requires creative innovations across many industries and occupations. All enterprises will need to gain an understanding of climate change risks and sustainable solutions. These challenges are made even more complicated given the COVID-19 pandemic. Not only is the virus not a hoax, but it's a symptom of a global economy that we all depend on and we all benefit from. And we're going to continue to see more pandemics in the future. Hopefully, we'll do better in dealing with them. This disease has killed over 200,000 Americans and has caused a massive economic meltdown. It's changed our economy, society, culture, and politics, and some of this change may be with us for a long time. The struggle to return to normalcy has overshadowed many of our steps toward environmental sustainability and decarbonization. Like climate change, addressing the pandemic's challenges will require creative thinking across many industries. And I believe we're going to see sustainability management become a more routine element of competent management practice. We also have to ensure the sophisticated integration of scientific knowledge into routine decision-making in both public and private management. Our well-being and possibly our survival depends on it. Rethinking solutions will have profound implications for various professions going forward. In our first session, we're going to examine the impacts of climate change and the evolution of the pandemic to teach us about the challenges and opportunities lay ahead. First, we're going to hear from keynote speaker, Sir Alex Halliday, Director of Columbia University's Earth Institute. Dr. Halliday is a professor in Columbia's Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, and he conducts geochemistry research at the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory. Before joining the Institute in 2018, he served as Dean of Science and Engineering at the University of Oxford. Dr. Halliday has received many awards for his scientific achievements and his contributions to science and innovation through his many hundreds of publications. Tonight, he'll be speaking to us about the importance of a broadly trained career in the context of a changing world and the proposed Columbia Climate School. Next, we're going to have a panel discussion on the impacts of climate change and what the evolution of the COVID-19 pandemic can teach us about the career challenges and opportunities for professionals that lie ahead. This panel will be moderated by my longtime colleague, Dr. Lerner-Lam, Director of Columbia's Master's in Sustainability Science program and the Deputy Director of the Lamont Observatory. Panelists will include Bradley Horton on planetary health, Patrick Askew on sustainable urbanization, Robert Klitzman on health and well-being, and Cindy Lott on access, justice, and equality. Our panelists are from different master's programs in the School of Professional Studies, or they are affiliated with the Earth Institute. The panel will be followed by a question and answer session moderated by Professor Beth Fisher-Yoshida, the Director of Columbia's Master's in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution program. We'll then end with a summary discussion by Dr. Lerner-Lam. These are difficult days, and the recent spikes in COVID-19 in this country and in Europe, along with the intensity of the current political season, are sources of great anxiety throughout our community. With this symposium, I hope we can stimulate meaningful discussion and begin to envision a path forward through these uncertain times. As I often say, I believe that humans are an ingenious species and we're not suicidal. And I have confidence that we will develop ways to address the challenges of climate change and global pandemics. And now it's my pleasure to turn this over to Dr. Art Lerner-Lam to begin this session. Art, take it away. Art, you're muted. Art, you're muted.
Yep. Thanks, Steve. Thank you for that fine introduction, and thank you for laying out the sequence and some of the goals of this series. As Professor Kuhn stated, this is the first of a four-part series in which we will explore aspects of careers at a time when awareness of the climate crisis and climate change, and if you will, the exclamation point of the COVID pandemic, show that global events and crises can really shift the landscape of knowledge and the careers that derive from the learning of that knowledge. The climate crisis is in some way existential. It is apparent that we are seeing more frequent severe storms and weather, and yet we know that over the long term, we cannot continue in the way that we are operating now. Change must come. The COVID pandemic, in some sense, teaches us about some of the strengths and weaknesses of our institutional response to global crises. But it also teaches us that collective action is absolutely necessary, lessons that we can learn when we try to solve or try to mitigate the climate crisis. So the point is, what can we learn and how do we apply what we learn to the global crises that are apparent to us right now? If it's not already apparent, the existence of these crises, the perception that we are not alone in our own fields, basically is changing the application of knowledge and how we use that knowledge to achieve solutions. The very fundamentals of careers are shifting underneath our feet. Now, learning what you want to use in your careers, learning what you want to apply, is very often driven by passion, by a notion that this is what you want to do. And converting that passion into practice in any institution or enterprise in which you work is the very next step. How do you actually apply what you learn? But this shifting landscape really requires an adaptive approach, a resilient approach. We are all lifelong learners to one extent or another, but the demands of dealing with these global crises on whatever scale that we wish to deal with them require that we continue to learn across fields, across disciplines, and learn how to integrate and bring together diverse opinions and perspectives so that we can truly achieve solutions that make sense. So careers must be adaptive. We can no longer be siloed in our individual knowledge domains, and we need to understand and apply a systems approach to that knowledge base and to achieving solutions. We need to collaborate. We need to form teams. We need to understand what we don't know, the unknown unknowns, as it were, so that we can fill in the gaps as a team and come to a fuller understanding of the problems that persist. And we have to do this quickly. And so we have to overcome obstacles. We have to develop collaborations, and we have to understand how the institutions that we serve can assist in developing those. So why do we do that? Well, these challenges are transdisciplinary. They are complex. There are going to be challenges and obstacles to gaining this systems intuition and the perspective. We'll need to collaborate, and we'll need to develop the appropriate tools across the disciplines. So one question is, of course, here we are in the School of Professional Studies and the broader university more generally, how should a great university like Columbia actually respond to these challenges in producing the knowledge base, transferring that knowledge base, and teaching that knowledge base to students in all of our disciplines? So one example of this is the forthcoming climate school. This is a development from the top down of the university to show what it will take to educate a new workforce, to develop new disciplines, to create new knowledge when the problems that we face are global and complex. It's not, it should be noted, of course, that the last school that Columbia actually created was the School of Professional Studies. And here we are again, a couple of decades later, forming a new school because there is a real reason to do it. There is a necessity to do it. So we're honored today to have Sir Alex Halliday speak to us about the formation of the climate school. Sir Alex, as Steve noted, comes from the University of Oxford. He comes over as the director of the Earth Institute, but now he has been charged not only by the university leadership, but by his own motivation to develop this new school, this way of developing new fields, new knowledge, and transferring that knowledge to a workforce that can help achieve solutions. So it's my pleasure to introduce Sir Alex. Please go ahead.
Okay, I'll go ahead. Thanks very much, Art. Thanks, Steve, who are, of course, amazing colleagues to me in the Earth Institute, apart from anything else. So it's great to be here, and it's partly great because I think the climate school is getting to the point now where there's lots to talk about, and there's lots that we want to discuss with people from the point of view of getting feedback and ideas. So we want to very much talk through what we're developing and why we're developing it, but also learn and actually think about how do we do this, because as Art said, we haven't formed a school for over 20 years at Columbia University. So if you talk to people around here, there isn't that much know-how about how you do it. A lot of the people who are in place weren't part of the process of building SPS or before it any other schools. And so, and many universities are thinking of doing something similar, and they're also stuck with the same thing. I was on the phone to Stanford and they said they hadn't formed a school for 50 years and they're trying to figure out how to form their school of climate and sustainability. So we're keen to get advice and all the rest of it. But one of the most important things we're keen to do is design this correctly from the get-go. It's much harder to change something once it's established. So it's really important to think very, very carefully while you're trying to get this something like this established. So having said all that, I should say that we're trying to move incredibly fast. And the reason is fairly simple, that this is an important issue that is going to change people's lives dramatically over the coming decades. And we haven't got time to hang around. We've got to get moving. So what I thought I'd do today is just share a few slides outlining what's been happening with the design of the climate school and where we're going to be, where we think we're going in the near future. And in particular, from the point of view of careers and how we see future careers changing and education changing in parallel with that. So I'm just about to share my screen. So you should be able to see that. Someone tell me if that's not working. And you might want to minimize all those little faces so that you can see it properly. But anyway, the climate school is now actually moving at a very fast pace, like I say. But there are a number of key parts to it that I want to highlight for you today. But this is the underlying vision and why we think this is really important that we move fast. So the vision is to provide the scholarship that is urgently needed to tackle climate change and related problems and provide potential solutions through transdisciplinary research, as Art was saying, partnerships with the outside world, novel education offerings, innovative technologies, and the sharing of ideas. So we had a number of versions of the vision that built on this and embellished on it. We've decided to come back to this rather, even though it's quite a long sentence. We think this actually sums up things quite nicely. So before going into the details of this, you could ask, why a climate school? And to some extent, Art and Steve have both touched upon this. Climate probably is society's biggest intergenerational human rights concern. This is going to, in fact, impact young people and future generations massively. And what we've experienced so far with climate change is nothing compared to what's going to be coming down the line, according to all the experts. So together with water and food security, biodiversity loss, disasters, it will actually disproportionately impact people that are already severely disadvantaged. And this is actually a really important point from the point of view of not just the fact that it's intergenerational, but it's going to impact communities that have actually contributed to the problem least in society. So there are major ethical issues about this and global governance issues that have to be addressed. which is one of the reasons why this is such a complex problem. It requires not just innovation in the form of new technologies, it requires innovative thinking about how you solve these problems. It's one thing for the scientists to come up with estimates of how much sea level will change, engineers to come up with new innovative engineering solutions. But there's a large amount that has to be done in thinking about how to make those solutions actually really work in terms of the people's acceptability, governance, etc., and how you deal with this financially as well. So the reasons why you're doing this in a university are obvious. That universities are trusted, academics are still trusted more than many other parts of society, including lawyers and certainly politicians. So universities are trusted to provide balanced thinking, carefully informed thinking. And so that's why they're really good. But also, universities encompass a wide range of disciplines. And we pride ourselves on recruiting the brightest and best as students, but also faculty, to provide what's needed to achieve this academic firepower that we need to tackle this problem. So a university, particularly one like Columbia with incredible breadth, is immensely important for doing this. Innovative education offerings are needed. We've got to think about what we need for the future, like no other subject. This is really important. And also we need engagement with communities, businesses and policymakers so that what we do actually has real impact. So this is where we've got to. Back in September of last year, Lee Bollinger announced we were going to be setting up a climate task force that I chaired. We met for a little bit over a month, 2 months, I guess. We had 4 meetings. We produced a 100-page report plus 100 pages of appendices, delivered it to the trustees by December, and it was agreed that we should move ahead. Through January through May, it wasn't clear what was happening because of the pandemic, but in April, President Bollinger said, we want to go ahead, even though we've got to do this in a time of fiscal restraint. And this has got to be budget neutral for the university, given the worries there are in every university right now about the impacts of COVID-19 on university finances everywhere. In June 2020, the trustees reviewed the school's design in outline form and gave unanimous approval immediately for us to move forward with this. And so we've gone ahead and announced this. We're now actually putting together committees, design committees, and we've come up with the idea of actually moving one of our master's programs that the Earth Institute currently delivers through arts and sciences into the climate school. So we've signed a memorandum of agreement that the Masters in Climate and Society will be delivered by the climate school going forward. And so we're looking to advertise that next month and get our first students in September of 21. So we're going fast while at the same time sort of designing the engine still. So just quickly to say, climate is a problem like no other in a variety of ways. It's a wicked problem. It's incredibly complicated and difficult for us to engage with. Really, really hard. And it also requires a lot of disciplinary thinking, interdisciplinary thinking. So this is why the Columbia Climate School is being designed with this, what we call a hub and spokes model, where we actually do have a hub of activity where we can think strategically and design stuff, but also we organize ourselves in concert with the rest of the university and support activities going on across the university. And the same hub and spoke phenomenon principle applies also to the outside world, where we are keen to build strong links and partnerships with other organizations because they all need to be involved in this as well. So this is complicated and yet immensely powerful. In last fall, we basically, as we were going around socializing the idea around the climate school and seeing what people thought, we also did a survey of how many people there were in each school who were working on issues to do with climate. And then, of course, you've also got the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory that doesn't sit inside any school right now, but it will be inside the climate school. And this adds up to roughly 1,000 people in terms of faculty, researchers, and staff, excluding students though. 1,000 people in this university who are working on climate or closely related problems. Every school we went to, we found people who are interested in this subject, whether it's nursing, whether it's English, whether it's history, social work, of course, lots of subjects that currently aren't being tapped very much by the Earth Institute. And yet at the same time, we have amazing capability across this university. So we have the academic firepower to tackle this better than anybody else, pretty much. And we need to engage aggressively in thinking about this, not just because we are ambitious, not just because we think we have an opportunity, but also because we have a responsibility, because we can do this probably better than anybody else, probably better anybody else in the world. So what's in that hub bit in terms of the design of the climate school? And this is where I want to really focus my main comments. At the heart of it is what we call strategic capabilities. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's kind of like departments in a regular school. It's actually what you're really strong in and what you're powerful in, and what gives you the ability to do, deliver things going forward. And of course, what we deliver will be education, and it'll be major research programs. But the strategic capabilities are really important. I'll explain those in a minute. I think they actually do form arguably the most important part of the school in terms of how we decide what we're strong in the design. The education programs and major programs about delivery, but actually you've got to first of all figure out what it is you're going to be good at to actually do that. But feeding into the strategic capabilities and the education and the major programs are some guiding principles that I want to talk about first. So the guiding principles are to do with the culture that you're trying to create. And that has to include right up front a focus on some of the issues that right now lead to social injustice in the world, where climate is going to have a massive impact. So we have to think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism in terms of what we believe is going to be important in terms of solving the climate change, the climate crisis going forward, but also in terms of how we want to be organized going forward. We have to think about careers. Why do we have so many people in the geosciences who are actually white? Why do we have so few underrepresented minorities in the geosciences? And that's really important. There's an opportunity for us there to engage, in particular in New York City, to try and address that issue in terms of the pipeline. We have to think about building opportunities for people in their careers in terms of what we call climate fellows. How do we create people who will be able to view this as something they really want to lead the world in going forward? And that includes the issues of not just learning about climate or learning about sustainability more broadly. It also involves learning things like communication and learning things like leadership. A lot of people involved in tackling the climate crisis and being outspoken, particularly on social media, are getting battered on social media. And they as individuals, that's not an easy thing to live with. They as individuals need to learn about how they deal with that from a leadership perspective. So we have to think about these things in terms of what we're providing people with, whether they're members of the faculty or researchers or actually students going forward. And then we also want this to be something that's about students very particularly. So there's no question that students care passionately about this subject. And so we want to engage with students, not just in terms of saying, oh, do you want to take this course, but actually asking them which courses they think would be good to develop, what would be actually really interesting. So we've got a process in place, firstly with the Columbia University Senate, to engage with the students who are involved there. But then we want to come up with we've designed a broader process of engagement with students so that they feel this is their organization going forward. And lastly, on this list, there are other things we could talk about, but we have a campus here which is woefully inefficient in terms of energy consumption. and a number of other aspects which are not very sustainable. This is an opportunity to use the campus as a sort of living laboratory, and students are very engaged with those issues as well. And we see this as something that Columbia, including Lee Bollinger, want to try and address going forward in the design of the climate school and how it engages with the campus more broadly. So there's another aspect of the guiding principles to mention, and that is that we need to think about communication and actually building a series of communication portals for the world. The Earth Institute already does a lot of this. We've got some fantastic stuff that goes on in terms of, and the numbers in terms of visits to our website are amazing. I think they're about the most visited in Columbia University. We also put on amazing conferences. So Radley Horton, who you'll be hearing from later, organized this amazing conference on managed retreat. It was the first of its kind ever last year. And so we're going to put it on again next year. Things are moving so fast in that space. We want to make it Columbia the place where we talk about that subject. And then there's opportunities for engaging with the arts in New York City in particular, whether it's the Shed or whether it's Carnegie Hall or whether it's using our own arts school here, which is fantastic. There are opportunities there. So there are a variety of things that involve policy hubs we can talk about, rather like the Center for Global Energy Policy, which is pictured here, but also many more that we could do, in particular in terms of providing opportunities for others to engage from outside the university, engage with Columbia going forward. So that feeds into what we call our strategic capabilities. And this is where we have a great opportunity to think about, you know, if you had a school of science, you would have maths, physics, chemistry, whatever. If you had a school of the humanities, you'd have English, you'd have modern languages, you'd have philosophy, etc. What are the key subjects that we think people are going to need for the future in terms of a school of climate? Well, of course, you'd think of climate modeling and glaciology. Maybe you think of energy storage, but you also need to think about environmental law. And there aren't that many people practicing climate law these days, or climate ethics, or climate human rights. Nobody's actually written the laws, the global laws, about what it is that, what will be the rights of refugees going forward, who are refugees from a climate crisis. We have plenty of written about that, and regulations and laws, international agreements about how you handle people who are refugees from a war zone. But what do we need in terms of not just academia, but also trained individuals who know about environmental and climate law going in the future, and human rights in that space. Climate finance is another example where there are very few people working on climate finance right now in the world, and yet it's very clear it's a massive issue. And the banking industry is thinking about it. The investment side of world is thinking about it. Insurance, they're all thinking about how climate change is going to impact companies, investments, and also what are the opportunities for investing in a different way going forward. So I think there are many things we should be thinking about in that context. But also there are going to be a lot of jobs in the area of all of these areas. Urban design is going to have to be transformed. The arts are moving into the environment tremendously. And there are also incredible opportunities, I think, in the broader subjects of sustainability, coastal engineering, energy storage. These are the bits that are going to be massively important, environmental health as well. So these are subjects that are going to be big, and there are going to be lots of careers, I think, in these areas as going forward. And so we have to be thinking about how we training people and providing them with what they need to take part in this going forward. So in terms of the major programs that we're going to be delivering in the climate school, these are the ones we've focused on. I'm not going to go into these in any detail. There are many more that we could think of going forward. But these are 4 areas where we believe the climate school could offer fantastic research power going forward. But if you, I want you to understand that all of these are strongly transdisciplinary. So coastal resilience isn't just about melting ice sheets. It's also about understanding how to build sea defenses, of course, but then it's also about architecture. How do you build properties that are resilient in South and East United States, or for example, in Mumbai? Then it's also about how do you actually deal with communities whose island states are no longer inhabitable? What are going to be their rights? And there's the financial aspects of what's going to happen to the property markets in the Southeast United States or many other parts of the world. Who's going to pay? Where are people going to be located? And as Radley knows very well, there's going to be a major issue in terms of the cost of relocating those people in terms of new infrastructure that needs to be built that will, of course, involve producing carbon. So there's going to be a lot of issues, complicated issues around something as simple that you might think as coastal resilience, quite apart from the whole issue of refugees. And, you know, there are many aspects of climate change that are already thought to have contributed to the Syrian crisis and potentially the refugee crisis that's developed in Europe. This is going to be a lot worse going forward. And colleagues in SEPA here at Columbia have been leading the way in trying to figure out and model what that will look like in the future. So let me just finish with some of the ideas we've been thinking about in terms of specific education programs. And these basically can be divided into the degrees and majors that we're thinking of offering, which are in mainly master's programs right now, but we are going to be thinking about new undergraduate majors. One of the things we've been thinking about, of course, is some of the topics I've just mentioned, like climate finance, disaster resilience. Let's build master's programs in these areas. There's the masters that we've already got in climate and society. But we've also been thinking about actually, you know, this is the first school of its kind. You know, once upon a time, there was not a business school. There was not a school of social work. And once upon a time, there was not a school of public health. But now we're in the point where actually a lot of people recognize these are important schools, and you have to have some special degree that represents your know-how in that particular area. So we're thinking about, should we build a special degree that will be a special certification in the area of climate going forward? And then there are non-degree things as well, which will be for school teachers, for many people, but also in particular businesses and government executives, etc., going forward. And Art Lerner-Lam has been leading that, particularly with his work with Alliance Bernstein, which has been amazing in terms of getting engagement. So that's all I really need to say. I think I just wanted to quickly run those ideas by you and bring you up to speed on what we've been thinking about. We're keen to talk further with people from across Columbia, but I think we particularly want to recognize that this is a generational problem where we look forward to particularly engaging with people who will be having to think about this in terms of their future careers going forward. So thank you very much, Art.
Thank you, Sir Alex, for an inspiring introduction to the climate school. I think this really shows how a great university can essentially change the definition of interdisciplinary work in many ways, and sort of look at the complexity of the real world and convert that into knowledge that can be applied as usefully and as efficiently as possible. We're going to turn now to a panel discussion to react to some of the points that Sir Alex made. And this notion that the climate crisis, the COVID pandemic, awareness of the global implications on what we do as scholars, as workers, as careerists. What is it about the global problems that's going to change the way we look at our careers in the future? What is different about the future than the past? And so we've assembled a panel to talk about those points. Our panelists are Radley Horton, who is a climate scientist at Lamont-Doherty and has been heavily engaged in the application of climate science in terms of producing actionable advice for government agencies and the private sector. We will also have Robert Klitzman, who is the academic director of the Masters in Bioethics at the School of Professional Studies, but he's also professor of psychiatry in sociomedical sciences at the Columbia University Medical Center and part of the steering committee putting this series together. Professor Cindy Lott is the academic director of nonprofit management in the School of Professional Studies. She too has aided us in putting this together, and she will be approaching this from her perspective in nonprofit management. And we will end with Professor Patrick Askew, who is in construction management, but is also the executive vice president of McKissick & McKissick and the deputy director of the new JFK terminal project, who will talk to us about how some of these tools could be applied. Remember, this is all about why. Why are we doing this? Why are things changing? Why are we having the symposium? And why must we consider this interdisciplinarity? Each of the panelists will speak for about 5 minutes, and then Professor Beth Fisher-Yoshida will entertain questions from the YouTube channel. Bradley.
Thank you, Art, for the chance to speak tonight. As a climate scientist, I'll talk in a little more detail about some of the things that Alex just mentioned, and then really turn to trying to reinforce some of these points about the need for transdisciplinarity, co-production, where academics are working across all aspects of society, shared learning, building new capacity, and really the need for us to be flexible, because I'm going to talk about nonlinearities and kind of surprises, good and bad, that are in front of us. So bottom line, since the Industrial Revolution, we've increased the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere dramatically. Carbon dioxide, for example, up about 45% now since the Industrial Revolution. You might have heard that that's led to like 1 degree Celsius, a little less than 2 degrees Fahrenheit of global warming. About 8 inches of sea level rise over the last century. You might be forgiven for sort of saying, that doesn't sound like very much. How can that be so important? So here we get to a few really important types of nonlinearities or sort of runaway effects, which I think are more familiar to us as we've heard about them in the context of COVID. So one of them is that this small shift, a little bit of sea level rise, a little bit of average warming, can mean a huge change in the frequency of the powerful extreme events that affect us. These coastal flooding events, droughts and severe fires out west. The risk of these things doesn't change a little, it changes a lot if we shift the baseline. So these kind of events become more common and far more severe. And that increase in severity is really important because there are also nonlinearities when we get outside of the climate system, when we move past the extreme weather events themselves and say, what does this mean for people, for agriculture, for our economy? There too, we have these nonlinearities. And we can think about this in the context of public health. The first degree of global warming or taking a 60-degree day and adding 1 degree of temperature, a couple degrees of temperature, essentially has no impact on public health. But if we now focus in on those really hot days, those days when it's 100 degrees or so, nudging those days up by just a couple degrees actually has an enormous impact. It means that energy demand for air conditioning goes up a lot. It means that people with pre-existing health conditions and even people who are healthy but needing to do strenuous work outdoors have far greater risk of heat stress, heat stroke. So there's nonlinearities in terms of impacts. Agriculture is another big example. Making those days a little bit hotter can mean crop yields crash, literally just a couple degrees more warming. So also in the space of impacts, I just mentioned a few examples in specific sectors, but what's really important, of course, is this potential for cascading impacts across different sectors because everything is intertwined, hence the need for this transdisciplinarity. I used to talk sort of abstractly about how extreme weather events can lead to impacts outside of the place that experienced the extreme weather event. I think that we all now, after this COVID experience, this COVID nightmare, have these real tangible examples of what we mean by that, right? So think about supply chains, right? From the sort of trivial examples of, not being able to get toilet paper or something, to really, really serious examples of cascading impacts, like the health vulnerabilities, the fact that the same communities that were dying at higher rates from COVID and suffering more economic impacts are also the same communities often that are really vulnerable to heat waves, coastal storms, and not just immediate risk, but these long-term health, mental health, economic effects that can cascade, lost jobs, for example. So the vulnerability is a key point here. These nonlinear cascading impacts associated with climate are many. We saw some of them in the context of Sandy, interdependencies between the electric system and the ability to pump water out of the subways, for example. We also think of this in the context of urban planning and what's sometimes referred to as economic death spirals. This is a big concern as these climate impacts cascade. Could we see a future where, as Alex alluded to, real estate values start to drop, maybe because insurance isn't as available as it was in the past? We're already seeing this in some of the fire zones out west. Prices could change really quickly from something where these climate events aren't really on a lot of people's radar to where the market is basically sending a powerful signal. And once prices start to drop, what's happening to your tax base? What's happening to the ability to fund critical infrastructure for everyone that helps support those real estate prices, the viability of the place? And often it's especially important for our vulnerable communities. So that's, some of these examples of cascading impacts. But all these sort of nonlinearities, these tipping points, can also be a path out of this mess that we've gotten ourselves in. Because another thing that COVID has shown us is how quickly society can change. We can be a really powerful lever in the context of climate to dramatically, quickly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and build a society that thinks about resilience and adaptation, so that every decision in every career is constantly thinking about protecting the vulnerable, not putting our assets in things that aren't going to be viable in the future. So in the COVID context here again, let's think a little bit about how quickly most of us shifted our behavior to wearing masks. Not all of us, unfortunately. In my field, we go to this American Geophysical Union conference every year. A lot of people have been paying lip service to the idea of not going in past years, and a few people have stopped, to reduce their emissions. COVID, I think, has shown us, hey, maybe we can, not have to do these conferences in the future. Look at bigger issues, bifurcations of investment in, say, fossil fuels versus renewables. COVID, I think, has changed the playing field. We're going to learn a lot next week, potentially, about where we're headed. Are we headed toward a world where we are propping up, dying, I would argue, fossil fuel industries, removing regulation, maintaining higher subsidies? Or do we maybe see a shift towards supporting, encouraging more renewables? That's the kind of thing that could have a really big impact. But in terms of our role, we are a social species, right? So think about youth, thinking about careers and the power that you all can have as you're, for example, deciding, as I pick my college, do I want to go to a place that really cares about reducing their emissions? And also thinks about their vulnerabilities to climate change, that protects their students, their workers. Do I want my first job to be with a company that's thinking about these things? Do I want to purchase products from companies that want to reduce their emissions and protect their supply chains and their workers and their assets from climate change? And then ultimately, as these people become investors, thinking about those issues too. These are powerful levers that can quickly get us to action. There are millions of examples, as Alex alluded to, in finance. The law also, as we're seeing more and more lawsuits that link damages from extreme weather events like Hurricane Harvey to fossil fuel emitters, or maybe to companies that have exposed assets, stranded assets in these zones. These two are really powerful levers where tipping points can rapidly move in our favor. So my bottom line, as I sum up, climate change really is going to touch everything. It already is. Look at the racial justice issues that have emerged as one example. It's all connected. I heard Alex say the other day that maybe all companies in the future are going to have climate officers or sort of experts in climate. But it won't just be climate, right? It's going to be people with this transdisciplinary knowledge who work as co-producers with existing institutions, learning from each other, whether it's research or implementation and practical issues. And we're going to need people who are flexible, who are able to come up with resilient strategies, even when we don't know exactly what changes we're going to see in the future. Resilient strategies for a variety of futures, for example. People who can help us adapt and mitigate. This is a grand experiment. We need this new data that we're coming up with, new science, but we also need people asking what inspires people to action? How do we get change? How do we motivate people to not just view climate as something to sort of protect against, but as a tool to make the world a better place across a variety of metrics, whether it's human resilience, public health, racial justice. These are really sort of the key tenets of the fourth purpose that's so central to the climate school in Columbia. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Radley. And thank you very much for making the point that we're beyond abstraction right now. In fact, reality is not abstract anymore. This brings us to Professor Cliffsman, who, as I said, is the director of the MS in Bioethics and is a psychiatrist at the Columbia University Medical Center. Bob, your turn.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers and to my colleagues and Sir Alex, wonderful thoughts, and it's very exciting what the climate school will be doing for all of us here at the university. As Arthur mentioned, I direct the bioethics program and I'm also in the medical school and the School of Public Health. And bioethics as background is the field that looks at the ethical, legal, and social implications of changes in healthcare and in biotechnology and advances in these fields. And so for many years, that's been everything from questions of who should get genetic testing. Should we genetically test everyone? Should we test embryos, fetuses, dead people? What do we do with the information? Questions of who has rights to access your health privacy information. Also issues of end of life, when to pull the plug, issues of designing babies, et cetera, stem cell research. Recently, we have also expanded, of course, to environmental ethics, and we have courses in environmental ethics and global catastrophes. And of course, COVID and climate change bring this all to the fore in very important ways. As background, and I would argue that what we do in bioethics is to teach leadership in emphasize the importance of needing a moral compass in no matter what we do, and especially in these important areas. And I would argue, in fact, that one of the reasons that we have a climate crisis and need a climate school is because we failed to deal with ethical dilemmas that have arisen. A major problem has been that people have said, on the one hand, I want to drive my car wherever I want. I want to make money off fossil fuels. I want to eat as much meat as I can. I don't care about the long-term risks that may be involved. With COVID, we face dilemmas every day now with who should get certain medicines. When we get a vaccine, who should get that vaccine? How safe should it be before we say anyone could get the vaccine? The FDA, for instance, has said that it would approve any vaccine that's at least 50% effective. That's a fairly low bar, and it's not commenting on how bad the side effects may be. And of course, 50% effective may be effective in creating antibodies, but they may be antibodies that bind onto the COVID but don't neutralize the COVID and may not last as antibodies more than a few months. So again, these are at core bioethical issues, and bioethics focuses on several major principles. One is autonomy and respect for persons, that we believe that people have certain rights to health, for instance. We also believe that we should be beneficent, that we should be helping other people, whether we're doctors or policymakers or researchers. We want to maximize the benefit we can provide to others. We also want to minimize the risks, the harms that are occurring. And we are concerned about social justice. There are the haves and the have-nots, and we certainly don't want to make that gap worse. In fact, we want to make it less than it now is. But these principles can conflict. Obviously, as I said, there are people who want to make money off of selling oil and selling cars, which are has been a big part of our economy, car manufacturers, for instance. But there are obviously long-term implications for affecting the health and well-being of people, particularly, as was mentioned, people who live in many poor countries and coastal areas are at grave risk of losing their houses, losing their income, losing their lives. And how do we balance the benefits to one group against the benefits to the other, or the benefits to one group against the risks to another? These are fundamentally issues that we in bioethics teach our students to deal with, to think critically, not just about these principles, but how we balance them. Because fundamentally, in all these problems, in COVID and climate change, there are difficult trade-offs. And we need to think critically of how do we teach the next generation and the current generation to address these trade-offs in ways that are as best as possible. I would argue that we've lost a moral compass in this country and the world in many ways. Many people traditionally got their sense of moral compass from their religion. We know that people are much less involved in traditional religious activities and religions than they were in the past. Many were agnostic, atheist, etc. And in our political dialogue as well, discourse as well, we've lost a sense of moral compass. And so I think that is crucial to realize that these are fundamentally moral issues. There may not be an objective answer to who should get COVID vaccines first, or how safe a COVID vaccine should be, or more precisely, there are ethical dilemmas, for instance, when should we lock down an economy or an area? When should we open up an area in terms of COVID restrictions? And these, again, are fundamentally part of these dilemmas are ethical concerns. And so even, for instance, in the law should reflect our ethical consensus in our country and in our world. And so the need for environmental law reflects a need for thought about what environmental law should be. What are the ethical principles by which we should decide, for instance, what the moral status of endangered species are? Do they have moral status? Many of us believe they do. Well, what should that moral status be? Of course, there are a lot of debates in our country now what the moral status of embryos, of fetuses is. And I would argue that these are not easy decisions. And yet we need to have a vocabulary and a framework and discourse for dealing with them. And that's what we in bioethics teach. And I think these are fundamental principles that all leaders who are dealing with these issues need to deal with. And of course, they are played out at many levels. So on the one level, we have global policy. We also have national policy, local state policy, and as well as individual lives that we're all enmeshed with, people making decisions for us, by us, or making decisions for other people, what we should eat, how much we should use fossil fuels, etc. And be able to tackle these trade-offs, to have a framework for thinking what are the laws, but how do the ethical principles in each of these situations play out? What are our gut feelings, which may be good or bad, but we need to be aware of them? What biases do we bring to the field? What information, what knowledge do we need to be able to answer questions? We in bioethics in our program have wonderful courses in environmental ethics, for instance. We have courses in the ethics of global catastrophes. I teach a course in global bioethics where we have the former world president of MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, for instance, talk every year about what the ethical dilemmas they face in dealing with refugee health, for instance, and a lot of health issues that come out of result from climate change. Due to climate change, for instance, we have malaria that's now appearing in areas of the world that did not have malaria before, because the mosquitoes that carry malaria are now spreading to other areas of the world. We have homelessness that is increasing in many areas of the world. And in many ways, we need to figure out how best to address that. Kaiser Permanente, for instance, the leading health insurer in California, recently decided that rather than just spend more money on homeless people when they come in with medical problems, that we should also buy them homes. So Kaiser is now building housing for homeless people, knowing that given the enormous importance of social determinants of health, that if we address those social determinants of health, many of which are affected by climate change, refugee issues, et cetera, that we can therefore improve the health and well-being of people in various areas of the world. We also do research. So for instance, with in many of these areas, to understand psychologically how people understand and look at and respond and behave given threats to climate and threats posed by epidemics is important. So for instance, research is needed on why people are not wearing masks. Why do they feel that they are immune? What is the information or misinformation they're getting? We need research, for instance, on why people feel that climate change is not important. What is underlying those who deny the impact of climate change? Or their psychological issues? If so, how can we affect that? And I think, of course, given the role of politics in a lot of this, to understand why people misunderstand key aspects of the need for attention to climate change and to pandemics is vital. And many of us are doing research, encouraging research on this, et cetera. I want to emphasize as well the role in the law. So many of us are involved in helping to develop policy, which comes out of ethical frameworks to figure out, for instance, even with COVID, what should we do if people are not quarantining when they should? Some countries, for instance, have said that they are putting an electronic bracelet on everyone who should be quarantined. And if you violate that, if our electronic tracker shows that you've left your house when you shouldn't have, the police will come after you and knock on your door. Well, that's something that we may not want to do in our country, but that many countries are doing. But the question is, what should be the penalty for people who violate quarantining or violate mask wearing, for instance? And again, these are fundamentally ethical issues. We also focus on communicating these issues, communicating science and the ethical issues that people face. How to communicate this to the public. The public, we know, does not understand science. I think it's important to understand more why they don't. Obviously, we need to increase science education, but also understanding the ways in which people have misinformation, the resistance to understanding science, and how to convey the fact that these are fundamentally ethical dilemmas that many of us face are all vitally important. There are things that we do in our program and the bioethics program, and that we encourage elsewhere as well in the university, that is thinking about the need for moral compasses, the need for understanding ethical issues and how to interpret and apply them in these specific situations. I think the more we do that, the better we'll be able to tackle climate change, tackle COVID, and make the world a better place. So with that, I'll stop, and I look forward to interacting more with my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. And thank you for bringing the notion of ethics, sort of layering on yet another discipline on top of the whole problem. We'll get back to that as later on. Now we're going to turn to Professor Cindy Lott, who's the Academic Director for Nonprofit Management in the School of Professional Studies, who will give us her perspective on some of the institutional issues associated with these global crises. Cindy.
Thank you so much. I want to thank everybody that has convened this, and I appreciate very much sustainability management, particularly leading the way here, and having Professor Halliday lead us off here. These are imperative conversations that we're having, not just this moment, but for all future. I think it's really important that we are doing this in an interdisciplinary fashion. I do lead the nonprofit management program. I can relate on a very micro level at starting something new. Our program is actually new in the field in many ways. There are not very many of us across the country or the world. It is interesting to start something brand new and make sure that it's interdisciplinary and to try to figure out where those major intersections should occur when you're trying to do both education and research and put things out in the field that will really make a difference. The students, I'm a lawyer by training, so I can relate to a lot of what is being discussed here about some of the new ways that we need to think about law, but also I work in policy, and it's something that we also think a lot about in our program. I want to address that. First, I want to say that we come as a mission-based sector, if you will, if I can speak on behalf of an entire sector, very much coming with some attributes that I think are very apt for this moment and apt for this discussion. When you enter into the nonprofit sector, wherever you may have come from prior points in your career, whether it's government or the for-profit sector, the private sector, when you step into our sector, you cannot avoid but being mission-driven. That's what we do. We arrive on the doorstep already with passion, which is something we absolutely have to bring to this fight and all that we're talking about, trying to make change and very quickly in the world. Passion is there. We need that, and we are happy to share. It seems to only grow when you share. It's not a zero-sum game. We've got that. We also are used to being very interdisciplinary. People back into this particular sector, this third sector, from all sorts of particular different substantive areas. Journalism, law, economics, sociology, political science, social work, public health. We have everything. Religion, we have all of it. It comes into our sector. People, as I say, our sector is embedded in every other sector. So we have something to offer there already, both as a model, but also in thinking about how we can work together collaboratively on these major issues. Whether it is a slow motion crisis, which has only picked up steam in climate change, or whether it is something that is occurring moment by moment in changes in the world right now with COVID. Whichever way you want to look at it on timeline, our sector has always been there on the doorstep, ready to go in communities. I think that's one of the biggest things that we bring as a sector is we think a lot and we are embedded in communities, which is going to be imperative for handling these types of issues. We know on the ground what these communities look like, what their histories are, and we are very good cultural, not just ambassadors, but translators often to the outside world that's trying to figure out how to come from one part of the globe or another sector or another perspective and step into communities and actually see the change that's happening on the ground. When all of us work together in a way, all of the different fields and trying to think how to conquer these big issues, we really have three major tranches, if you will, of work. We first have the prevention moment. We have response, which is often the just-in-time response, no matter what it is, whether it's climate with a particular disaster going on, and we've had multiple, unprecedented amounts and levels of climate disaster in the last years, or with COVID, where we're simply having to react incredibly quickly. And then lastly, we have reconstruction and renewal in communities. And those are three different areas that all of us will be working together to conquer. I would say that the nonprofit sector has mostly focused on the response, the on-the-ground response, just in time. And also we are often one of the last groups of folks standing on the reconstruction and renewal, who are still in those communities long after everybody else has left, because there's no longer media attention, or we've moved on to another disaster, obviously. We've got enough to go around. So I would say those three big areas are something we need to work on. And the nonprofit sector is really starting to engage more, and this is particularly important for career considerations, on the prevention piece. This is where we get into working with policymakers and where we really start working with scientists, et cetera, researchers, about what we can be doing in these communities around marginalized, vulnerable communities. And I'm so glad to hear the other speakers address that this evening. It's so important that we remember this piece as we go in for any kinds of solutions. And I appreciated that on the slides from Professor Halliday, also with the climate school, particularly addressing anti-racism, inclusion, equity issues, social justice. These are all connected, but they're slightly different, and they come at different points in actual reactions to these types of disasters, if you will. And just now, it's even beyond disasters. It's just our daily lives that we're having to deal with, both, as I say, the big issues of climate and then also COVID happening as we're watching. So we're in a living petri dish right now. We're watching these vulnerable communities. We're watching marginalized communities in real time, trying to figure out what to do, who've been historically already underfunded and often not paid attention to. I appreciated the comment that some of the problems we're existing with now that are extant are because we were not looking at some of the ethical considerations, which absolutely include diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations. We teach ethics in our program for a reason. We're the first place that has an entire class around it, because we feel that it is that fundamental, and we present an applied framework that I created for our students to actually walk through how we are going to apply ethics. It's not just in the ether. This is real and must be applied on the ground. So our sector has something to offer the others as we do this. I would say that for our particular students, as we think about career changes, we've conquered a lot of things in the nonprofit sector. We're very good, as I say, about embedding in communities. We try to be better and better about making sure that we really understand culture, that we really can cross disciplines. As I say, we've done a lot of those things for a long time. It's only become in the last 30 years that the field has actually been recognized as a field. And in many ways as a field of study. But here are some things that I would say that our sector has really, we are going to have to step up on, and we can learn from other sectors. There is no one of any of these issues that will ever be resolved by one sector alone. We are never going to have one substantive area of study or the for-profit, government or not-for-profit sectors that are ever going to conquer these big issues alone. It is always going to have to be around public-private partnerships, collaboration, interdisciplinary nature of research and action. So this is one thing. We're pretty good at collaboration in our sector. We've had to, because we were traditionally under-resourced. And we're doing that often on behalf of communities that are traditionally under-resourced, correct? So one step beyond that, though, is really understanding how we actually use some of the levers of finance, the mechanisms around social impact, and really talking to the communities that do have money, now that we see how absolutely interconnected we really are in the world. And COVID has brought that to bear in a very immediate sense, that even the most marginalized, vulnerable communities have huge impact on even the most privileged communities in this world. There is no more pretending that you can divide those types of communities. We are interrelated. The next big thing I think that our leadership, if you will, in our sector is really going to have to take on is really learning how to use technology and learning from some of the other substantive areas and disciplines about how much better we could use technology in order to help these communities. And that is connected to a third area, and that's big data. So this is something that's somewhat new to our sector when we really think about using big data to move the needle on certain issues. This is something that we talk a lot to our students about. We wish that we had even more interaction, and I'm hoping that the climate school will be a great model for showing how that can be done. One of the issues that we face on equity and access around big data is who counts. We talk a lot about that in a class that I teach. You know, power means you get to decide, whoever the most powerful and entitled and privileged folks are in the world, what counts in the rest of the world, who counts in the rest of the world. The marginalized communities don't get to say, hey, count me. Somebody else has to determine that we're going to do that. And the more we can be thinking about that from the start, that we build into our technology, we build into our big data algorithms, that's going to be really important. Artificial intelligence and algorithms are great for being able to simplify, reduce, count vast amounts of data, but they also have the ability to lead over entire communities and populations. They have the ability to simply ignore just due to the nature of what they do. And I think we need to be really cognizant of that on the front end of when we are creating technology and our research studies dealing with big data, to be aware of what has not already been counted. So we're going to have to invent new. And our sector needs to be engaged in that, which leads me to my last point. We absolutely have to be, as a sector, and I'm passionate about this in our program, around policy and advocacy. And not just after the fact, not just as, you know, as the charity case, as I often say, pun intended, to the other sectors or to government, but that we have to be asked as a sector right up front about policy and advocacy considerations, so that we who know these communities can really step up and say, here's what we think ought to be built in, baked in into these systems. It's incumbent upon our students and leaders in the nonprofit sector to truly understand these levers, and policy and concomitantly advocacy are two of the biggest pieces that we are trying to teach our students and show how powerful it can be. Tonight's convening are two of the major issues, but they're only two There are still more out there, and that's what we're trying to teach our students now through leadership. We have lots of different classes that do this, ethics, big data, analytics. We also deal with communications, of course, and we actually teach policy and advocacy and disaster philanthropy in our program. All of these are interrelated for a reason. So with that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker, but I want to say again how much I already can see the interdisciplinary nature of tonight really serving as a model, I think, for what we can be doing here across Columbia and across higher education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cindy, and thank you for pointing out what I think many people suspect, that the nonprofits are usually the first ones on the front lines in many ways. We'll return to that. But how do we actually do this? In many ways, urban planning, urban design is one of these integrative fields that has to bring all of this knowledge together in order to achieve some solutions. And we're honored to have Patrick Askew. Professor Askew is in the construction management program, but he's also a vice president of McKissick and McKissick. Patrick, take it away.
Thank you, Arthur, and it's a pleasure to be here, and it's an exciting time. I do think that climate issues and the climate threat to this planet is one of the biggest challenges that we face as a society. And it's exciting to see that Columbia is taking on this challenge and the school that's being created to be able to address that. So one of the things I want to sort of talk quickly about is that in my role as a practitioner in the field of engineering, design, and construction, I get to see every day how the climate challenges of our society impacts the ability for people in my industry to work, to deliver their projects, and to actually execute on some of the things we do as design and construction professionals. So as mentioned, I teach in the School of Construction Management, Construction Administration, and the course I teach is capstone, and I do teach other courses, but the capstone course really is a combination of the coursework that you learn throughout the entire design and construction and administration, and then you really culminate those classes into this one capstone class where you're learning to actually apply everything you've learned into how you would actually execute it as a practitioner in the field. And a few points really quickly to sort of understand, and I want to be able to give folks a taste of what what you should be thinking about, or what students should be thinking about as they move into their respective fields, and particularly as it relates to the climate challenges we're currently having. One of the things I think is important is that you have to be nimble in your skill sets. If anything, we've learned from this pandemic is that when you're going into certain programs and you're learning in an industry like design and construction, or any industry for that matter, you have to be able to have a degree of nimbleness within your skill set to be able to, again, apply those skills to the environment and to whatever the environment and how we have to react to the environment. So you can't be sort of myopic in your thinking with regard to your skill sets. Broaden your ability to be nimble, understand that this won't be the last pandemic. Climate change is here to stay, and you're going to have to be sort of nimble in your skill sets to be able to apply those skills to areas for which you may not have been traditionally trained. So it's very important to have a degree of nimbleness in your skill set. The other thing I would say is that what I try to teach my students is that you have to also, from a leadership standpoint, have a risk-based management approach to your leadership. If anything, this industry has taught us is that climate change and the pandemic, you have to have ability to think about how you manage risk. And you have to have a management strategy to manage that risk and apply it throughout your leadership. So if I would advise anyone, I would tell them definitely really focus a lot on how you approach managing risk throughout your leadership, and how do you look at risk. And if you can, take as many risk courses as you can take that applies to your particular industry. Having a risk-based management approach to your leadership is very important. You always should try to incorporate it. Again, if this industry and this pandemic and this climate change has taught us anything, is that we need to make sure we have an approach to managing risk. So another thing I would sort of focus on also is also having an understanding of how climate change and how the pandemic in itself has impacted your industry, and have a clear understanding of it. Have an understanding of it from an industry standpoint, and have an understanding of it from a specific job function standpoint. A lot of students are coming out and they're having a hard time really relating how they can translate their skill set into an opportunity given the circumstances that are going on in the world. You have to see yourself in the framework of being able to translate how climate change and the impacts of climate change will affect either opportunities for you in this space, or how will it affect your ability to function in your job, and forecast that out. Because again, this is going to happen before, again, 100-year storms are now occurring quite frequently. And you have to imagine yourself in a position to be able to, again, shift and pivot into a space where you'll be able to do your job under the circumstances that, the climate environment has sort of put in front of us. So it's very important to be able to understand how your industry and your job specifically is going to be impacted by climate change. So you really want to get into that and study that. And you should always have a strategy in place to respond to these climate changes and how the impacts these climate changes affect your day-to-day work. What I mean by that is that you should focus on having mitigations, having a backup plan, having an insight into where these opportunities are going to open up. And the reason I say that is because as the, in my former position as the executive vice president for the Economic Development Corporation, my portfolio of jobs was hundreds of jobs. And we did a lot of resiliency work. We focused a lot on building facilities that were weatherized for infrastructure issues. We built a lot of facilities that we had to do flood mitigation for. And a lot of these projects and a lot of these planning for these projects happened years in advance. And I didn't come into the industry with a background in building, flood mitigation structures, nor did I come into the industry as a young engineer, even having a insight into climate change and how it would affect me from a design and construction standpoint. I had to learn that as a result of the impacts. I had to learn that as a result of Sandy. I had to learn that as a result of the global pandemics. One of the things that we had to do in our industry was build a massive, a large testing facilities for the city to deal with the pandemic. And that is not something you learn in class. So no one saw a program in place to build hundreds and hundreds of testing facilities for a novel pandemic like this. But as an engineer, as a construction professional, you had to pivot and understand how this has to get built, because this was important to our society. And this is very important to the way we come out of this thing. So again, this, as a civil engineer and someone who recognizes that you have to really look at the root of the terminology civil engineering, and it's an engineering function that is there to be able to support and advance the civilization. You have to understand that it's very important that you take that to heart, especially in this environment that we live in now. And that's one of the things I was sort of mentioning to a few students recently, is that when you see what's going on in our community, you see what's going on with this pandemic, you really take pride in the profession that you're in, because it really speaks to the contributions you can give. And I think as someone who really sees the importance of, again, civil engineering and what the university is trying to convey to our communities, I think that the one thing I would leave you with is that be proud of what you do, be focused on what you do, and understand how your work impacts our society. And that's how I would sort of leave this sort of conversation.
Thank you, Professor Askew. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Beth Fisher-Yoshida, who will be monitoring or asking the panel a few questions that have come in from the YouTube chat. And take it away, Beth.
Thank you, Art. So just in a very brief summary, we've heard from 4 very passionate panelists about their views on the pandemic, on climate change, and so on, from the cascading effects of climate change to the moral compass and ethical considerations, to focus on prevention through nonprofit organizations, to aspects of civil engineering and construction management. So we do have some questions that were sent to us prior to the panel and some that are coming in as we speak. So I'm opening up to the panel. The first question is from Promeet Chatterjee, who's a guest here, meaning not a student or an alumni. And the first question I'll pose to you is, how does a post-pandemic climate change battling future change the course of existing job profiles as opposed to newly created ones? So what are the existing profiles of the careers? How are they changing? And what are the new emerging careers that are coming about? Who would like to address any aspect of that question?
Well, I would just say that I think that what COVID and climate change show is, or are a lot of the unpredictabilities that the world, our world, will be facing. And I think just to highlight some of what has been said is the need to be nimble, the need to have a portable set of skills to think critically, to think what kind of information do I need, what kind of research do I need, what kind of data do I need, and to be able to weigh competing claims. We live in an increasingly conflicted world in all kinds of ways, and be able to say, okay, group 1 wants this, group 2 wants this. How do we weigh these conflicts? What are the long-term risks, the short-term risks? What are multiple stakeholders who need to be brought to the table each think? I think those are skills that are portable, as we've heard, because we'll be post-COVID at a certain point, but we'll be pre-COVID 22 or pre-COVID 23. We're now COVID-19. So there will be another pandemic that'll be different, or another crisis that'll be different.
Thank you, Bob. Somebody else want to respond to that from the panel?
You know, I think that a couple of jobs come to mind, I think, that are starting to become even more prevalent. Jobs in the safety industry, the planning industry, and the policy industry. So obviously, writing proper policy for dealing with these types of pandemics, these types of climate changes is very important. Being prepared from a safety standpoint, obviously having better prepared safety professionals. And obviously, I think that it's very important that you have someone who's able to do strong risk mitigation and risk management. And I think those skills are going to be very important in this industry going forward. And you have to sort of look at job opportunities that require those.
I would just add a couple things. I think that the advocacy piece cannot be overstated. I think, and it's not just on behalf of marginalized communities and vulnerable populations, which I think clearly have to have a voice, but I think we are seeing right now on the ground globally for all sorts of things that are happening, including so much around racial equity issues and other equity issues, that advocacy is a real space. And while it's always been a bit, it's out there, but kind of tapped into at certain times, at this point, there is no such thing as just, an election cycle timeline. It is advocacy all the time for the various areas or substantive areas. So I think that's one area. And of course, it completely follows on policy and impacts and informs policy. The other piece that I think is large, such as the nimbleness that has been mentioned here, is synthetic thinking. It's really important, and in a lot of fields, you're driven to be a specialist in some form. I know we certainly do that in the law and other areas. And it takes a lot for people to kind of resist that, or to be a specialist, but still understand that you have competencies, but there is a competency around understanding what you don't know. And that you can have the humility to ask and to make sure you understand that things are interdisciplinary, and that's a strength, not a weakness, that you actually need to ask for help. But once you have those other competencies in the room, I think it's not just critical thinking, it's synthetic thinking and understanding how these things come together and how you piggyback on other people's understandings, competencies, and abilities to reach other communities and cultures and other parts of our societies. It's really going to matter for all of our particular areas.
Great. Radley, did you want to weigh in from a climate scientist point of view?
I might cede my time if that's all right, so we can get another question in if that's okay.
That's wonderful. Here's another question from Olivia Bowers, who's asking, would it be better to integrate programs into institutions before college to get young individuals interested to continue studies in this area and increase the dialogue within research in the future? So it's really asking about where should we start the conversation? Where should we get people involved in their education, starting to think about these issues?
So I think there's a tension because I think on the one hand, the earlier the better. On the other hand, I think to develop some expertise in some aspect of it is important. Everyone can't be a complete generalist in everything. So I think to be able to say, on the one hand, to have studied, let's say sociology or psychology or, climate science or the law or whatever, to be able to sort of have as something that you have depth in and then also get breadth. So I think to be able to do both is important. And I think to be aware that you shouldn't just get the depth, just I'm only going to study this and that's my one area. So I think especially in college, to be broad, find what you're also most interested in, what you are passionate about most, what you're most, usually that means you'll be best at it, but then also to not have blinders on and to take in the breadth that we've been talking about would be great.
Anybody else want to comment on that? I know that the Earth Institute and the School of Professional Studies both have high school oriented programs. And I saw before this panel, I saw some presentations from some very clever high school students on addressing sustainability issues and so on. So people are already thinking about that in that space.
Yeah, just sort of say quickly, I think especially these sort of applied options where, students get to, at the high school level, get to sort of really engage, can be helpful. There's this sort of pessimism, optimism, and sort of risk of paralysis. So my gut feeling is overall, young people are already worrying about these issues. Inform them as much as you can so they can get towards a proactive place of feeling engaged, and sort of a sense that they can contribute to solving these problems is beneficial for individual psychology. And also there's this sort of moral force that I alluded to a little bit in my remarks, and others did too, of early engagement. If kids say that this is a generational issue for us, I think it's hard for groups to really tune that out.
Great. Okay, I think we have time for another question here. So here, Jason Job asks, in addition to disciplines listed in Sir Alex's slides, would it be useful to address socially based resistance, especially in the US? Religion, politics, ethics involve local, non-academic leaders. Something about socially based resistance.
So yes, I think this is what Cindy particularly was alluding to, is that we need multiple stakeholders. We need people from, quote, the community. Of course, there are many communities. And I think that these are global problems. And we can't just have a policymaker in Washington or Albany making these decisions. This is something that needs to come from the ground up and from the top down. So absolutely having, I see it as multiple stakeholders, but I think that's what the questioner is alluding to. I think that's extremely important.
I want to add also, politics, policy grow out of representative culture. That's what we do in government. That's what we're doing in policy ostensibly, is representing viewpoints. So if there is resistance, that means that's a communications issue. That means we are not doing our job, not because the resistance exists, but if over time you cannot seem to break down some barriers around understanding basic facts that we should be sharing. People may have different priorities around those facts, but we have a much bigger problem right now about just simply agreeing that a fact is a fact. And those kinds of issues are dealt with in communities by understanding exactly what Bob just said, which is what are their perspectives? These are stakeholders. The problems we've run into often is because we have somebody from, I'm here from the government, here to help you kind of moments at times, and not understanding that in those communities, they have to be listened to first. And if you do that, you have a much better chance of actually arriving at least some shared understandings. It's definitional problems before we go into the actual policy and advocacy levers, if you will. And that's, I think, a lot of what we're talking about. It's not just here domestically, but it's internationally as well, that you have to be embedded in those communities to overcome some of that resistance over time. And you may never be completely successful, but everyone's entitled to a perspective.
I think Sydney makes a great point. And just if I could just add to that, I think that what's interesting about it is that as an African-American man in the space that I work in, I think that obviously one of the things that came out of the earlier lecture was the amount of sort of diversity within the field. And to be able to achieve equity in this field and look at the moral compass and talk about a lot of things that we have already been addressing, we have to talk about how do you embrace policies that bring a level of diversity into this field so that everyone can see everyone in a field that reflects society. And I've honestly been in this industry for a long time. I've had a handful of people that I've worked with in the African-American field that are actual environmental scientists. So, and some of it has nothing to do with culture or anything like that. It's just lack of exposure to the field. And I think that is something that is, an issue that I think something like this, a climate school would definitely be able to address. And I see that as an important factor.
Thank you so much. So this is just the beginning of ongoing conversations that we're having, and we're not going to be able to address all the questions that came in, but we will figure out a way to do that. And please join us on December 2nd when we have our next session. I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Art.
Thank you, Beth. Well, passion, practice, and resilience. Those are the sorts of the concepts that we're trying to get across in terms of career design and the ways in which you ought to approach the acquisition of knowledge. I want to commend the panelists. We heard from Radley Horton that no longer are we in an abstract space. The climate change crisis, the prevalence of the pandemic have shown us that reality is here and that we have to deal with it in very complex ways. Patrick talked about the ways that could be applied in a particularly heterogeneous field, a field that requires a lot of input from a lot of experts. Cindy Lott talked about the ways in which community is important and the notion that advocacy and activism are going to be central to and will reflect the passion with which you approach your career. And of course, Bob talked about ethics. In many ways, ethics and equity are the connective tissue for the ways in which you knit together all the aspects of things that you want to approach. So I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank Sir Alex for giving us a keynote, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. This is the first of 4. The next one will be on December 2nd. We hope to see you then. Take care, and we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.